stays united at this time and that we achieve a second United Nations resolution. And I say to my honourable friend, the reason why we should have such a resolution, as his question implies, is that for many months now, we have been waiting for Saddam Hussein to come fully into compliance with the United Nations resolution that was passed unanimously by the United Nations. It is time that he did so. If he does so, even now, conflict can be averted. But the worst thing that could happen is for the will of the United Nations to be expressed so clearly, for him to defy that will, and then for no action to follow at all. Vote to the United Nations on a second resolution. We continue to work for that flat out, and we will do that in a way that most upholds the authority of the UN. US going it alone. Let me just say this to him and to the House. Of course it is true that the United States could go alone, and of course this country should not take military action unless it is in our interest to do so. It is the British national interest that must be upheld at all times. But the reason why I believe it is important that we hold firm to the course that we have set out is because what is at stake here is not whether the United States goes alone or not. It is whether the international community is prepared to back up the clear instruction that it gave to Saddam Hussein with the necessary action. That is why I am determined that we hold firm to the course we have set out. But I think at the moment the best thing is to go flat out for that second UN resolution. I am trying to do so, and it might just help if I say to the House the types of things we're discussing with other partners at the moment in the UN. What we are looking at is whether we can set out a very clear set of tests for Iraq to meet in order to demonstrate that it is in full compliance, not partial compliance, but full compliance. For example, based on what the inspectors have already found, the anthrax, the thousands of litres unaccounted for, either produce it or produce the documentation showing it is destroyed. For example, since the last resolution in November, we have not had one single interview of an Iraqi scientist outside Iraq where they and their families can be guaranteed safety. We should make sure that Iraq is allowing those interviews to take place. For example, the unmanned aerial vehicles, the things that can spray this chemical and biological poison, we should ensure they either produce them or produce again the documentation that shows they're destroyed. Now, I believe if we set those conditions out clearly, if we back them by the will of a United Nations, then we have a chance, even now, of averting conflict. But what we must show is the determination to act if Saddam will not fully comply. I agree it is an embarrassment for me to find myself in agreement with the Right Honourable Gentleman, or him in agreement with me on the issue of Iraq. But we are actually agreed, and I think rather than scoring the points, which are perfectly acceptable, and I understand them, actually, at this point in time, when we're facing quite momentous decisions for the country, it's probably better that we discuss the substance. The one thing I've found in the last few weeks is that I've not been short of advice from anyone on this particular issue. But I do honestly say to him that I think the most important thing for us to do, actually as a House, never mind as a government or as a country, is particularly with our armed forces facing the potential of action, to come together, to work very hard in the United Nations to secure the second resolution and to try and make sure that we send the strongest possible signal out to Saddam Hussein that he has now to disarm or face the consequences. And I say again to him, it's better to concentrate on that than the points he's just made.
Tony Wright.
Member of every administration around the world, including occasionally even my own, as we've just been pointing out. So what I would say to him very simply is this, that rather than debate the wealth of conspiracy theories and comments from the Republican right or the Democrat left or this part or that part, why don't we just work out what it is that it is the right thing to do and do it? I think the right thing to do, whatever anyone else may say, we went through the United Nations because we believe in it. But I think I said right at the very beginning, when we went down that UN path in September of last year, the UN has got to be the way of dealing with this not the way of avoiding dealing with it. And that is why it is important now, 4.5 months on, when Saddam is not fully complying, that we come to a crunch and take a decision. And we have tried to provide within the UN framework a set of conditions that allow us to test very clearly, drawn on what the UN inspectors have said, whether he's fully in cooperation or not. And what I urge, even at this stage, is for countries to get behind that and help us with that, because that is the best way, in fact, of achieving disarmament peacefully.
Charles Kennedy.
Mr. Speaker, has the Attorney General advised the Prime Minister that a war on Iraq, in the absence of a second United Nations resolution authorising force, would that be legal? What is the advice the Attorney General has given?
As I said on many occasions, we would not do anything as a country that did not have a proper legal basis to it.
Charles, given that this week the United Nations Secretary-General Kofi Annan has said that in the absence of a second United Nations resolution, we would be acting in a way which breached the UN Charter, is Kofi Annan wrong?
No, Mr. Speaker. What Kofi Annan has been saying, and I agree with them, is that it's important that the UN comes together. And that's why we are trying to provide a basis, a compromise, even at this stage, that allows us to resolve this matter properly. Although I do say to him and to the House, it is complicated in getting that agreement at the United Nations when one nation is saying that whatever the circumstances, it will veto a resolution. Now, I hope he would accept that we cannot have such a situation and that we have to make sure that we deal with this in the terms of the resolution 1441 that we all agreed upon, including himself. 1441 gives the legal base for this. The reason why we have been seeking a second resolution is because, as I said to the liaison committee when I appeared in front of them, it's obviously highly desirable to demonstrate the unified will of the international community. Everything we can to achieve that second UN resolution. And to be frank about it, I think many people thought we might be in action even now, but we haven't. We have delayed precisely in order to try and bring the international community back round the position we set out in 1441. But I go back to that the whole time because it was at the heart of the agreement that the United States take the multilateral path of the United Nations. And the agreement was very simple, that they had to agree to go through the United Nations and resolve this through the United Nations, but the other partners inside the United Nations agreed that if Saddam did not fully comply and was in material breach, then serious consequences and action would follow. The fact is, he hasn't complied. 4.5 months on, indeed 12 years on, he has not complied. And that is why it is important we bring this issue to a head now and get it resolved. I remain, as I say, working flat out to get it resolved through the United Nations. That's easily the best thing. It would be a tragedy for the UN when faced with this challenge if it fails to meet it. But we do have to make sure that the unified will set out in 1441 is implemented. What he said was that if Saddam Hussein refuses to disarm voluntarily, then conflict becomes inevitable. And that, of course, is the position that we've set out throughout. In respect of the vote here, I have made it clear, and so has the Foreign Secretary on many occasions, that subject to the security and safety of our troops that must come first, we do believe it is right that this House has a say on this issue. And then people will be able to see both the stand that we take, and then people will have to make up their minds as to the stand that they take.
Dr. Vincent Cable.
Is the Prime Minister aware that yesterday the American government issued invitations to 5 American corporations led by Mr. Cheney's Halliburton Group to bid for the reconstruction of post-war Iraq and pointedly excluding British and foreign firms? Is the Prime Minister not embarrassed to have given such unstinting loyalty to an American president who regards international cooperation with such contempt and regards war as an opportunity to dish out contracts to his cronies?
I think I don't agree with him at all, I'm afraid, in relation to that. And in respect of the American president and international cooperation, I would remind the honourable gentleman that it was as a result of many requests made to the US president. He went through the United Nations last year. And I think it is right now that the will of the UN is upheld, and I would hope that he would agree with that. I said all the way through that I hope it is, and that it is important, as I said a moment or two ago, that we have a vote in this House, subject to the caveat I've always entered. But I hope the honourable gentleman would also understand that it's important that I set out as Prime Minister what I believe to be right in this country's national interest. And I've tried to do so over these past few months, and I have set it out because I think there is a real threat to this country from the twin sources of international terrorism and weapons of mass destruction, and if we do not deal with them, our world and our country will be a less secure and more dangerous place. And I hope that he and others on the benches opposite will join us in that endeavour. I think that the point that my right honourable friend makes is absolutely right. That is precisely why we need to take action. And I simply say that the idea that we can leave British and American troops down there for months on an indefinite timescale without insisting clearly that Saddam disarms, that would send not just a message of weakness out to Saddam, but a message of weakness right across the world. That is why it's important that it's dealt with. I hope that even now, those countries that are saying they would use their veto no matter what the circumstances will reconsider and realise that by doing so, they put at risk not just the disarmament of Saddam, but actually the unity of the United Nations. It is not the convention to publish legal advice, but it is the convention to state clearly that we have a legal base for whatever action we take. And of course we must have such a legal base. But I think that the argument for the honourable gentleman's constituents and others, and I understand the concern there is and the strong arguments there are on the other side, but the argument surely is this, that in circumstances where we believe Saddam is a threat, and I think most people believe that, in circumstances where we've demanded that he cooperate fully with the United Nations and he's not, and everyone accepts that, then unless we act and enforce that cooperation, we are setting the will of the United Nations at naught, and we're also saying to Saddam, you can carry on building these weapons of mass destruction and we will do nothing about it. And if we send that message to him, then I just ask him and ask his constituents, if we send that message to Saddam that he can carry on disarming and we do not have the will to stop him, then the next time either he or another tyrant or dictator tries to arm themselves with such weapons, what credibility will the will of the United Nations have then? And that is why we have to act. The point that my right honourable friend makes at the end there is very important. Since we all agreed to take the multilateral route last November, and let's be clear, not everyone in every part of every administration may have wanted to take the multilateral route, but we did it. And we did it on this basis, that Saddam had a final opportunity to disarm, and that if he didn't comply fully, unconditionally and immediately with the UN inspectors, he was in breach and serious consequences would follow. Not a single person in Europe, not a single person in the rest of the world believes that he is cooperating either fully or unconditionally, and certainly not immediately. And I think my right honourable friend is absolutely right. What is at stake here is the whole integrity of the multilateral process, because unless we uphold it now, we are never going to be able to uphold it in future times.